These crystal clear waters are part of a delicate and threatened environment. I love snorkeling on reefs like this, but the real reason for coming 8,000 miles from home is to look at a subject that I just couldn't ignore in a series about survival. In this program I've come to the tropics, to where the South China Sea meets the Pacific Ocean, to look at the classic survival scenario of staying alive on a desert island. These are just some of the 7,000 islands that make up the Philippines, and they make this corner of the world the perfect place for a would-be castaway. The island I'm heading for is the most remote and inaccessible location in this series. I've flown south from Manila for 2 hours to the island of Palawan, travelled 7 hours by road, and I'm going to be on this boat for 3 hours, which means I'm going to arrive well after dark. The boat I'm travelling on is a traditional wooden banker. They've been used here for centuries, and the crew use centuries-old skills to navigate. They have to find their way through a maze of reefs and atolls with no charts or radar, but they know these waters like the back of their hand, and they can even find their way in the dark. I love arriving in wild places at night. You simply can't beat it because you've got no idea at all what's here. All you've got to go on are the smells and the sounds. At times like this, your imagination simply runs riot. But that can work both ways. You could imagine that this would be a pretty threatening place if you were cast away here for real. Psychologically, it's vital to feel comfortable with your surroundings. So when the sun comes up, I'll start to explore every corner of the island. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on a few simple comforts. A hammock is my favourite way to sleep in the tropics. But there's one really important tip when you're on an island, and that is don't tie it up to a coconut tree, because the last thing you want in the night is to be brained by one falling on your head. It's been 3 years since I was last on an island like this, and I can't wait to use some of the skills I learned then. At times like this, I always feel a huge sense of anticipation. But the first rule of survival is not to rush into anything. Quiet reflection, taking stock of your situation, should always be the first priority. And sitting by a simple fire is amazingly comforting if you've just arrived in a strange place. Well, this is what I couldn't see when I got here last night. Paradise, everything you'd expect a desert island to be. A blue sea, pristine beach, with coconut palms behind. The classic tale of desert island survival has to be Robinson Crusoe, a story that's now over 300 years old, but as popular today as it ever was. There are even Caribbean islanders who claim to be descended from him, despite the fact that he's a totally fictional character. Crusoe's tale was inspired by a Scottish sailor called Alexander Selkirk. In 1704, he marooned himself on a Pacific island after falling out with his captain. He was terrified at first, but he overcame his fear and loneliness to stay alive until he was rescued after 4 years. It's incredible to think that the basic skills he used 300 years ago still have any relevance in the modern world, but they do. 1945, and the battle for the Pacific raged on the sea and in the sky. Until the Second World War, no one had given any thought to military survival training. Now, though, a pilot could get shot down hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. If he survived that, he'd have to know how to live off his wits until he was rescued. John Craighead and his brother Frank were pioneers of military survival training. They taught airmen how to live off the land while avoiding capture.
We taught them how to travel in various types of terrain, how to build shelters. We taught them plant foods that they could find and use, and how to make fish hooks and whatnot so they could catch fish. And then we taught them how to build a fire and how to climb coconut trees, although you have to be in pretty good shape to do that.
But the training was carried out in the United States, so downed airmen would have no experience in tropical survival before they needed it for real. So survival was a pretty hit-and-miss affair, basically coming down to how well an individual serviceman could adapt the training he'd received in the United States to this particular environment. As I'll show you, there are specific skills you need to know, otherwise your chances are slim. So after the war, the American military decided to improve the odds. They sent the Craigheads to the Pacific to gather as much information as they could from local people.
We made trips into the jungle and kept notes of the kind of plants we found and what we lived on, and got a feel for how difficult it would be.
They compiled their findings into a survival guide, which has been used by the US military ever since. They found that preparation was the key to survival. The tools they had with them were almost as important as the resources they found. Even now, people often wonder, what luxury would they take with them to a desert island? For me, the answer is solidly practical. My personal luxury is going to be this, a parang or machete, because a tool like this simply makes life possible here. Many of the US airmen who found themselves on islands like this didn't even have a knife with them. And in some cases, they died because they couldn't open a coconut to get at the food and liquid to be found inside it. Here, local people call the coconut the tree of life. It provides them with materials for building and clothes, with wood for fires, and of course, it's a ready source of food and drink. The secret is to find a coconut that's so full of liquid that when you shake it, you can't hear any sloshing around, because that's the life-giving fluid in there, a safe drink. And this is how you open it. That first cut is to produce this, a little spoon with which I can scoop out the contents of the coconut later on. That's delicious. It's a warm drink, absolutely beautiful. Now you can drink about 4 of these a day. That's about 4 litres. If you drink more than that, it acts as a laxative with some pretty dire consequences. And of course, once the fluid's been drunk, we take our spoon and scoop out the flesh inside. So it's a drink and a meal all in one. And in 1943, the humble coconut saved the life of Bill Coffin, a US fighter pilot with an amazing story of survival. Bill was forced to ditch his plane and bail out 240 miles inside enemy territory. His life jacket was damaged, but he managed to struggle out of his parachute harness before it dragged him under. Suddenly, instead of returning to base, Bill was adrift and struggling to remember survival techniques he'd learned in the States and thought he'd never have to use.
You know, an airman doesn't figure he's ever going to get shot down, but the training gave him enough information to have a reasonable chance of getting back.
Bill spent 2 days adrift with no food or water before being washed ashore. He'd lost all his emergency rations and medical kit, but he had managed to salvage